Okay, now let's have a look at how you implement auto-enrollment within Opera 3 itself. The first thing you need to do is you need to go through and you need to record your staging date, and that's quite important because the software looks at the staging date to do various actions. So how do you record the staging date? Well, if we hop back into Opera, and within Opera, under the utilities, you'll note there's an option here for auto-enrollment settings. If I select that particular option there, it allows you to go through and define the staging date. So here you set in whatever the particular staging date is for your particular company. As you can see here, I've set mine to be the 1st of April. Notice as well, there's an option here for pension regulator settings. And if you select this particular option, it shows you what the various thresholds are. So for instance, earlier on we were talking about a qualifying earnings lower threshold. Annually, that's set at a value of 5668. And we talked about the enrollment threshold in the current tax year set at a value of 9440. Those are the annual values. However, depending upon your payment frequency, they'll have different values here. So if you're running a monthly payroll, then what it will do is it'll be looking at those figures. If, for instance, you're running a weekly payroll, then it'll be looking at those figures. So what I'm really saying there is those annual values are annual. However, the actual calculation is calculated each time you run a particular payroll within the system itself. So if you're running a weekly payroll, it will look at those values and it will do the assessment based on those values. Next thing you need to do is you need to look at your payment profile. Again, I haven't activated auto-enrollment within the software yet, but these options are now available to me. So if you look at the payment profiles, what you'll see is under the payment profile itself, you'll see there's a new option there which is called auto-enrollment. Remember what we said is that you've got to go through and you've got to identify which pay elements build up to something called qualifying earnings. And qualifying earnings is pretty well anything that an individual earns. So it's going to be things like salary, wages, overtime, commission, bonuses, even things like statutory sick pay and statutory maternity pay. So for each of those types there, you need to go through and you need to tick this box here which says auto-enrollment. And what that basically allows the system to do is to identify which of those pay elements build up to qualifying earnings. You need to set up pension schemes because obviously you're going to auto-enroll workers into a particular pension scheme. So within the software itself, under the maintenance, it allows you to set up those particular pension schemes. If you've got an existing pension scheme that you want to use and you confirm that it is a qualifying pension scheme, well then you can simply tick this box here, use for auto-enrollment. And what it basically means is that that pension scheme is available to you to auto-enroll workers into. However, I've actually set up a pension scheme here for Nest. So we can see here, I've obviously ticked this box, use for auto-enrollment, because that is the reason why I've set up Nest. Notice as well, with the Nest pension scheme, I've also set up the contribution levels to be 1% employer, 1% employee. In other words, I've set it up from whatever your staging date is up until the end of September 17. Remember, when you get to the beginning of October 2017, you need to change those percentages to be 2% employer, 3% employee. And remember, when you get to October 18, that changes to 3% employer, 5% employee. So you must remember to come through and change those in the future. Notice as well, I've set the earning restrictions to be between the auto-enrollment thresholds. So in other words, it's going to do these calculations between, in the current tax year, 5668 and 41450. If you're using Nest, remember that Opera has an ability to directly link into the Nest website. So in other words, there's an electronic transfer between Opera and the Nest pension provider. That is a chargeable option, so you need to talk to your Pegasus partner about the charges for that. If you intend to use that electronic integration, then there's two other things you need to know. Under the maintenance option, you need to go through and you need to set up pension groups, and you must set up at least one pension group because Nest requires a default pension group to be set. However, can you see here, I've actually set up two. I've set up one for the monthly and I've set up one for the weekly. In other words, I set that based upon the payroll frequency. But you can go through and set these groups up for other levels, for instance. So if, for instance, you're considering that you might have two Nest groups, one is going to be for workers that are paying at the minimum levels, and you might have a second group for those workers where you might be paying enhanced contributions to it. In which case, what we're saying there is you might be setting groups based upon contribution levels. Or you might even do it geographic. In other words, you might have an office in Glasgow, you might have an office in Newcastle, you might have an office in Manchester, in which case you might want to set it based upon those geographic locations. If you go onto the Nest website, you'll find that they do have a description of how these groups can work. But remember, you must set up at least one. The other thing you need to know as well is you need to set up a payment source. Nest requires these payment sources to be set up within Nest, and therefore you parallel set them up within Opera. And when you're registering with Nest, one of the questions they're going to ask you is, how are you going to pay the Nest contributions across to Nest? In my example here, you can see that I've set up a payment source called direct debit. So in other words, my contributions that I need to pay through to Nest will direct debit my bank account. So therefore, on the Nest site, I need to go through and I need to define the bank account, the sort code, and the various other details associated with that bank account. And then in Opera, I just need to set that reference code for the payment source plus a description of it. If I therefore go back into the pension scheme, you can see within the pension scheme for Nest, under the provider tab, I have an ability here to go through and define which export files I want to create. And in this example, I'm going to create a Nest export file. It allows me to define for which group, in which case in this I've set it up for the monthly group. It also allows you to go through and define the payment source. And in this case, I've set the payment source to be direct debit. Notice there's some other options that you have here as well. One of the options is to hold on to contributions. If you go through and tick that particular option, what it allows you to do is during the opt-out period, it allows you to hold on to those contributions and not hand them across to Nest. And the reason you might want to do that is that if somebody opts out, then it's recommended that you pay back those contributions to them within 1 month. If, however, you've held on to those contributions, it means the money never left your bank account. So therefore, on the next payroll run, you can hand back those contributions through to those people that have opted out, and the rest of them then will automatically get transferred across through to Nest. So that can be quite a useful option for you to set. Notice there's another option there as well, which is employee opt-out via provider. If somebody is going to opt out, then what they need to do is they need to go to their pension provider and they need to ask for an opt-out form, which they fill in and they can hand back to the employer so that they can mark them as an opt-out from that pension scheme. However, with Nest, you have ability to do that online. So that when Nest go through and send you the information pack about the pension scheme, one of the options on there is opting out. And if you choose to opt out, then you can log on to the account within Nest and you can put in the opt-out information, and therefore Nest will come back and they will notify the employer that that worker has opted out. So it allows you to go through and know that you're opting out via Nest. Okay, what do you do at your staging day? Well, at your staging day, you need to turn on auto-enrollment within the software. So, under the utilities set options, you'll see on the second page, there's an option to use auto-enrollment. If you tick this option on there, then it tells you that auto-enrollment processing is now just about to be switched on. And what it's telling you there is do not turn this on until you get to your staging day. Well, we're now at our staging day, so I'm now going to turn on auto-enrollment. What's the next thing you need to do? Well, you need to categorize your workforce into one of those three categories that we discussed earlier. How do you assess your workforce within the software? Well, if I go to an individual, in this case I'm logging into the processing form and I'm going through to Richard Godson, notice now, because I've turned on auto-enrollment, we now have access to the auto-enrollment details. And if I select that particular option there, it allows you to set the category of a worker. So in other words, you can set the category of the worker to an eligible job holder, non-eligible job holder, or an entitled worker. In other words, you can start to do this manually. If you want to go through and auto-enroll them, then I could auto-enroll them, or if I wanted to postpone this individual, then I could go through and I could postpone this particular individual. So what I'm saying is the first option you have available to do this categorization is to do it manually from within the system. Although we're not recommending you do that because you need to know, for instance, what their salaries are, you need to know their ages, and you need to know all the rules that make them an eligible job holder. So, can the software help us? Well, yes, it can. If I'm on Richard Godson and I take the option to do a calculate, notice the calculation sets the category of that worker. So, in other words, the calculation has been modified to assess workers into one of those three categories. And in this case, it's set Richard Godson to be an eligible job holder because it knows how much Richard earns, and it also knows the age of Richard and the other items that make Richard an eligible job holder. If I say OK to that, the software can set Richard to an eligible job holder. However, it then passes it over to you to identify the category further. So in other words, is Richard going to be auto-enrolled, or are you going to postpone Richard's auto-enrollment for 3 months? So you've got the choice here to choose one of those. The software obviously can't make that decision for you. You need to make that decision. If we now go back and have a look at Richard, look at the auto-enrollment details, what we'll see is Richard has been set to an eligible job holder on that payroll date based upon those earnings. So in other words, the calculation can do this. Again, I'm not suggesting you do this individually. Let's go through and run the main calculation across all of those employees in that monthly group. This is now going to do the normal calculation for you, but because you're now doing it for all of your workers, it's going to go through and it's going to assess all of those workers based upon their earnings. And if we print this report out through to screen, here we can see Richard Godson, being set to an eligible job holder, has had a whole range of other workers here. Mrs. Owen has been set to an entitled worker, and so on and so on and so on. So in other words, the payroll calculation can categorize your workers into each of those categories. But then it tells you that you've got to make the decision as to whether to auto-enroll or to postpone them. Let's have a look at the pensions report, the auto-enrollment details. And let's run this report off as a summary report so we get a consolidated list of the workers in that monthly scheme. And again, I'll send this report through the screen. And here we go. We can now see what's happened to these workers. We can see that some of them have been set to eligible job holders. There's one that's been set to an entitled worker. There's someone that's been set to a non-eligible job holder. So in other words, the payroll calculation goes through and assesses your workers into each of those categories. So what's the next thing we need to do? Now that we've categorized the workers into one of those 3 categories, what's the next thing we need to do? Well, we discussed earlier that we need to send various communications to those workers. So let's assume, for instance, that we want to tell the eligible job holders that auto-enrollment is going to happen to them this particular month because we've reached our staging date. We need to go through and we need to send them that particular letter. However we send that letter is by the by, but we need to notify the software that we've done it. How would we do that? If we look at global changes, there's an option here for auto-enrollment updates. And if I select the auto-enrollment updates, this allows me to go through in bulk to update information associated with those workers. So I can select them by profile, employee from, employee to, departments from to, pension schemes from to. In my example here, I'm going to tell the system that all those workers that are marked as an eligible job holder, that I've sent them the information pack from the pension provider telling them about auto-enrollment. So all of my eligible job holders, what am I going to do for them? Well, I'm going to go through and I'm going to send them the auto-enrollment information to the employee, and I'm going to send them that information on the 1st of April because I was prepared to do this. If you're going to decide that you're going to postpone for 3 months, what you would actually have done at this point is select the status to postpone and set the status date to be from today's date, in which case it will postpone them for up to 3 months. But in my case, I'm not going to do that. I am actually going to go through and auto-enroll these workers. So in which case, send information to the employees about auto-enrollment. It shows you all of the workers that fall into that eligible job holder status, and I can be selective. I can select them all. I can select individuals from that. In my example here, I'm going to auto-enroll all of those people. So do you want to select this? Yes, please. In which case, it's now going to go through and it's going to give me an audit trail report. And here we go. Here are all of those workers that are now going to get that information pack. So their status as an eligible job holder, but they haven't yet been auto-enrolled or postponed. If we now go back and have a look at Richard, we'll be able to see what it's done to Richard. So under the pensions, auto-enrollment details, we can now see that the information pack was sent to Richard on the 1st of April. Okay, let's assume now over the next 2 weeks we've handed the information over to Nest, so in which case they now know which workers are to be auto-enrolled, and we're now getting to the point where Nest is able to make them active members of the pension scheme. How would I tell the software that someone's being auto-enrolled into Nest at a date 2 weeks down the line, for instance? Well, again, we'd use the global changes. If we go into the auto-enrollment update, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select all of those eligible job holders, and what I'm going to do for those eligible job holders, I'm going to change their status. I'm going to change their status to be auto-enrolled. Auto-enrolled when? Auto-enrolled on the 15th of April. Into which pension scheme? I'm going to auto-enroll all of those workers into my Nest pension scheme. Did you send them the information pack from the pension provider? Have they received all that information about the pension scheme they're being auto-enrolled into? Well, the answer is yes. I'm going to say they've received the contract-based information from the pension provider and it's being given to the employees. And on what date did they get that? Well, they got that on the 15th of April. So I'm now telling the system that all of them are auto-enrolled into Nest and they're being given the information pack. It shows you each of the employees that this is happening to, and I can therefore be selective still. It's warning me that just check the pension age, because some people may be in the pension age. No, I've already checked that, so I'm happy about that. In which case, it's now going to give me the audit trail report that's going to go through and show all of those workers that are just about to be auto-enrolled. And here's the report. They're all eligible job holders, but their current status is set to none. If I now update this, that will have gone through and that will have auto-enrolled all of those workers. The other thing I need to do now is I now know the date that they were auto-enrolled and I know the date they were given those information packs. I'm now going to tell the system to set the opt-out period for them. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to select all of those eligible job holders, and I'm going to tell the system that I want to set the opt-out period start date. And the opt-out period start date, in my example here, is going to be the 15th of April. Because that was the date that they were either auto-enrolled or that was the date that we sent them all of the information. In my example, it was both on the 15th. Here are all those workers. And if I print out the audit trail report through to screen, here are all the workers that are getting that information. Notice now, however, the current AE status has been set to auto-enrolled. And therefore, if we now go and have a look at Richard, we have a look at Richard's auto-enrollment details. Richard has been set to an eligible job holder, has been auto-enrolled on that date, and has been given the information regarding that pension scheme on that particular date. What happens if Richard wants to opt out? How does Richard go through and opt out? Well, under the postponement or stop, notice we have the opt-out start date and opt-out end date. So in my example here, it's from the 15th of April to the 14th of May. If we get the opt-out notice from Richard in that date sequence, then Richard will be marked as opting out of the pension scheme. If Richard gives us an opt-out notice outside that period, can Richard opt out? Well, the answer is no, Richard can't. Richard can cease membership at any time Richard wants to cease membership. So outside the opt-out period, then Richard can't opt out. But outside the opt-out period, Richard can cease membership of the pension scheme. Remember, if Richard opts out within the opt-out period, then any of the contributions will be returned to Richard. If Richard ceases membership after that opt-out period, then those contributions will be retained by the pension provider, and Richard can then cease membership based upon the rules of the pension scheme. And those rules might be different from pension scheme to pension scheme. For instance, the pension scheme might say you have to give us 3 months' notice before you can cease membership, in which case those are the rules that would apply. You must also remember as well that on the pension scheme, you need to put the date that Richard left that particular pension scheme. Registering with the pensions regulator. If you want to register with the pensions regulator, then you must do it within 5 months of your staging date, but within the software itself, it allows you to go through and record that particular date. So if you go into the software and we go into the auto-enrollment settings, it allows you to go through and put in the date that you registered with the pensions regulator. Now remember, it's useful to record that because you won't remember the date. So, 6 months, 12 months down the line. So we recommend that you actually go through and you put in that registration date there. Registering with the pensions regulator is an online process. So in which case, if you select the online process, it allows you to go through and record online when you've registered with them. It actually allows you to print out a checklist because there's a range of questions that they're going to ask you for that registration. And it also allows you to go through and run out a video as well. So if you run the video, then within the video itself, it describes the various figures that you need to fill in for auto-enrollment. Let's now have a look at Nest integration. Remember what I said earlier, you can electronically send files from Opera through to Nest. How do you do that? Well, I've activated Nest within my system, so in which case, when I go to the pensions report, I have two options. One is the auto-enrollment file, and one is the contribution file. So I can go through and I can generate these two files so that I can upload them to the Nest site. The enrollment file contains all the personal details of those workers that Nest require so that they can register them as a member of the pension scheme. And the contribution file contains the details of the contributions from the worker as well as the contributions from the employer. Let's go through and let's create the auto-enrollment file. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to create the auto-enrollment file for these workers here. So let's go through and let's say that we want to create that auto-enrollment file. Here are all the workers that are on there. There's 25 of them in that set. And I'm going to tell the system, do we want to create it? It tells me there seems to be an issue with some of the data. So specifically it's telling you here there's something wrong with the address of some of your workers. So in which case, if I run this report through to screen, I'll be able to see the issues with those workers. And what it's telling me here is there's a problem here with somebody called Derwent. And the problem with Derwent is that there seems to be an address and a postcode missing. So in other words, when you're sending this file across through to Nest, it actually does a validation to make sure that the data is correct. So we actually go and have a look at Derwent and see what's wrong with Derwent's name and address. If I look at the details and bang, well, I can see that there isn't an address there at all. So let's put Derwent's address in. Okay, so I've now put an address in for Derwent. It's also warning me that I've set the normal hours to be other. Remember, you only ever do that if somebody has an irregular payment pattern. Okay, let's go back into the pensions report and let's create that auto-enrollment file again, this time having corrected the data. So here we go, those are the employees, there's 25 of them. It's no longer giving me that error message because I've now corrected the data so that it's now valid to go through to Nest. I'll print the audit trail report to screen. And here we go. Here we can see all of the individuals that are now being sent down to Nest. It then creates the file. So it's created a file called Z_pensions enrollment file, and it's created that file in your company data directory. So what you now do is you log on to the Nest site, and when you log on to the Nest site, one of the options there is to upload the auto-enrollment information. So you point it to the company data directory, and it will load that information into the system. Okay, I'm now going to run a payroll calculation. The reason for that is that I've auto-enrolled those workers into the Nest pension scheme, but I haven't run a payroll calculation since, so in other words, it doesn't know what the deductions are. Now I'm going to run that, so it's now calculating the deductions for those workers into the Nest pension scheme. And it goes through, does the normal calculation, and it gives you the normal calculation audit report. let's go back to the pensions reports and let's now create the contribution file for those workers. So which pension scheme? Well, it's the monthly pension scheme. It was run for the pay period of the 1st of April to the 30th of April, paying nest on the 22nd of May. Here are all of those workers. That's fine. There's 25 of them indeed. It therefore gives you an audit trail that shows you the contributions that are now due to be passed across to nest. And here we go. I can see all of those workers, and I can see what the employee contribution is, what the employer contribution is, and therefore the total contributions that are going through to nest. It then creates the file, so Z underscore, the pension contribution file, and that's being created in the company data directory for this particular Opera company. In which case, you now log on to the Nest site, and one of the options within the Nest site is to go through and upload your contribution file. So you point it to the company data directory, and it will upload those contributions. And then once it's uploaded those contributions, it will report in those contributions to each of the workers in the Nest pension scheme. Okay, what about other pension providers if you're not using Nest? Well, we had committed to go through and create the links into the group of pension providers called Origo, and you can see there's 13 of them there. However, this group of pension providers have gone through, and it's taken them about 18 months to come up with the specification for linking into them. However, over that time, only 2 of them have now confirmed that they will adopt that specification. So in which case, it's unlikely that we'll link into Origo now, and we will produce, therefore, we'll go through and produce for the pension providers individual links to individual pension providers. If you are using somebody outside Nest, then you need to go through and talk to your Pegasus partner to tell them which pension provider you're using, and then, therefore, they need to go through and assess how you can electronically transfer that information through to them. Remember, you need to go through and you need to keep your employees informed. So you need to communicate quite specific messages. And we discussed this in an earlier YouTube video. Remember, you need to send eligible job holders, you need to send them details of the pension scheme. Non-eligible job holders, you need to tell them that they have an ability to opt in. Entitled workers, you need to tell them they've got an ability to join a pension scheme. And if you've already got people in the qualifying pension scheme, you need to tell them about the impacts of auto-enrollment. So there's a whole range of letters that you need to send out. Is there anything Opera can do to help you with here? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to identify who gets what letter. But remember, what happened there is the payroll program did that automatically for you. So in which case, you could use Pegasus XRL to extract out that Opera data from the payroll where it identifies their particular category. So in other words, you could extract out into an Excel spreadsheet all of those details for your eligible job holders, including their name, address, date of birth, and what have you. And for your non-eligible job holders, the similar sort of information. And remember, you can download those letters from Nest, or you can download each of those letters that we saw earlier. You could download them from the pensions regulator. And what you could do is you could therefore mail merge the information from your Excel spreadsheet, extract it out using XRL, into Word, and therefore you could generate those letters, and you could therefore send those letters to those workers. So Opera allows you to go through and do that communication. If you want further information on this, log on to the Pegasus website, pegasus.co.uk, go into the Media Center, and within the Media Center, you will see a whole range of videos, short videos. Here's one for credit management, but there's a whole range of them on there. If you're interested in knowing more about XRL, well, then go and have a look at the XRL video. If you want to know about something called Payroll Self-Service that was released at the end of last year, well, then have a look at the video for Payroll Self-Service. And if you're using Opera 2, then there's a whole range of new functions that are available to you in Opera 3. So just go and have a look at each of those individual videos. Okay, that concludes this part of the presentation. I hope you found it useful, and thank you for listening.